January 17th, 1942, Bataan Peninsula, Philippine Islands. The jungle air hangs thick with moisture and the acrid smell of burning oil. Through the canopy, shafts of tropical sunlight cut across a muddy supply road where American and Filipino forces are retreating southward, their boots sucking at the earth with each exhausted step. In the distance, the rumble of Japanese artillery grows louder, a metronome counting down the hours until the next assault. And there, navigating a crater-pocked trail that no vehicle should be able to pass, a small, boxy machine painted in olive-drab churns forward, its engine whining, its chassis bouncing over roots and rocks like a mechanical insect. Japanese scouts concealed in the undergrowth 300 meters to the east lower their binoculars and exchange glances. One officer, a lieutenant named Takeshi Yamada, allows himself a thin smile. In his notebook, he records his observation in precise characters. Enemy deploys toy trucks. No armor, no dignity. Victory is assured. He does not yet know that he is looking at the beginning of a revolution. That this ungainly little vehicle, barely larger than a motorcycle with 4 wheels, will become the most produced military vehicle in human history. That within 3 years it will be climbing mountains in Italy, fording rivers in France, racing across deserts in North Africa, and delivering supplies to partisan fighters in the jungles of Burma. That it will be photographed more than any other military machine of the Second World War, its image synonymous with American resolve. That it will outlast empires, outlast ideologies, and outlast the very men who laughed at it. The vehicle is the Willys MB, but history will know it by a simpler name, the Jeep. And on this humid morning in the Philippines, as the Japanese 15th Army tightens its noose around Bataan, no one, not even the exhausted Americans driving it, can imagine what this machine will come to mean. To understand why Japanese officers laughed, one must first understand what they expected war to look like. The Imperial Japanese Army of 1941 was an institution built on ritual, hierarchy, and the veneration of suffering. Its officers were samurai descendants in modern uniform, trained to view hardship as a crucible that forged superior spirit. They marched into China, Malaya, and the Philippines with a logistical philosophy rooted in centuries of warrior culture. Soldiers would endure. They would carry their own weight. They would eat less, sleep less, demand less. The Japanese infantryman was expected to survive on a daily rice ration that would starve a European soldier within weeks. Their supply lines were lean by design, not by necessity. Vehicles were for heavy artillery and senior officers. The common soldier moved on foot, or if fortune smiled, on a requisitioned bicycle. When Japanese planners studied American military doctrine in the years before Pearl Harbor, they found it simultaneously impressive and contemptible. The United States possessed industrial capacity beyond imagination, factories that could produce tanks, aircraft, and ships at rates that defied comprehension. But this abundance, the Japanese believed, revealed a fatal weakness. Americans were soft. They required comfort. They could not endure the purifying hardship that transformed men into warriors. A 1940 Japanese military intelligence report recovered after the war from archives in Tokyo summarized American motorization with barely concealed disdain. The enemy cannot march. He must ride.
He cannot carry.
He must transport. He has built an army for roads, not for war. The report concluded that American forces, once separated from their vehicles and supply networks, would collapse like a building stripped of its foundation. This was not mere propaganda. It was strategic doctrine. The Japanese had watched the German blitzkrieg tear through Poland and France with combined arms tactics that emphasized speed and armored striking power. But Japan was not Germany. It did not have petroleum reserves. It did not have the industrial base to produce thousands of trucks and half-tracks, and so Japanese military philosophy made a virtue of limitation. Where Americans built supply chains, the Japanese cultivated endurance. Where Americans designed logistics, the Japanese designed asceticism. The result was an army that moved fast and struck hard in the opening months of the war, living off captured supplies and the momentum of victory, but which carried within its structure the seeds of its own starvation. And then they encountered the Jeep. The vehicle itself was born not from military brilliance, but from bureaucratic desperation. In the summer of 1940, as Nazi Germany completed its conquest of France and the British Expeditionary Force fled across the English Channel, the United States Army recognized with mounting alarm that it possessed virtually no modern equipment. The army that would face the coming war had fewer than 100 tanks, aircraft designs from the previous decade, and a motorized transport system that relied heavily on civilian trucks never meant for combat. What the army needed, and needed urgently, was a light reconnaissance vehicle, something that could replace the motorcycle with sidecar, carry a crew and supplies, mount a machine gun, and navigate terrain where roads did not exist. The specifications were drawn up in June 1940 by the Quartermaster Corps. The requirements seemed almost absurdly ambitious: a four-wheel drive vehicle weighing less than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying a 600-pound payload with a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, a ground clearance sufficient for rough terrain, and a price tag under $750 per unit. It needed to be simple enough for a farm boy to repair with basic tools, reliable enough to function in deserts and jungles and mountain passes, and versatile enough to serve as a reconnaissance car, ambulance, supply hauler, weapons platform, and command vehicle. Oh, and the companies bidding on the contract had just 49 days to deliver a working prototype. 135 companies received the specifications. 133 concluded the requirements were impossible and declined to bid. Two companies, Willys Overland and American Bantam Car Company, were desperate enough to try. Bantam delivered first on September 23, 1940, with a prototype that worked but was too light. Willys followed with a design that was too heavy but had a more powerful engine. Ford, sensing opportunity, reverse-engineered both prototypes and submitted its own version. The Army tested all three designs at Camp Holabird, Maryland, driving them up mountainous slopes, through mud pits, across streams, over logs and ditches and obstacles that would cripple a civilian automobile. The Willys design, powered by a sturdy 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, proved the most capable. By July 1941, the standardized Willys MB entered mass production. Ford began building an identical version under license, designated the GPW. Together, they would produce 640,000 units before the war's end. The name Jeep itself remains disputed. Some claim it derives from the military designation GP, general purpose, though the vehicle was actually classified as a quarter-ton truck. Others trace it to Eugene the Jeep, a cartoon character from the Popeye comic strip, who could go anywhere and do anything. What matters is that by 1942, every American soldier knew what a Jeep was. It became the iconic symbol of American mobility, appearing in newsreels and propaganda posters, in war correspondent photographs and infantry memoirs. It was the vehicle that carried Eisenhower through London, Patton across Sicily, and MacArthur back to the Philippines. It was the steel embodiment of a particular kind of American pragmatism, not elegant, not impressive to look at, but ruthlessly functional, and the Japanese, at first, simply could not take it seriously. Reports from the early battles in the Philippines describe Japanese reaction to captured or abandoned Jeeps with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The vehicles seemed almost comically small compared to the heavy trucks the Americans used for bulk transport. They had no armor. A rifle round could puncture the thin metal body. The canvas top provided no protection whatsoever. The seat padding was minimal. The suspension was harsh. By the standards of a nation that venerated the tank and the heavy artillery piece, the Jeep appeared to be exactly what Lieutenant Yamada had written, a toy. But then they tried to follow it. The jungles of Guadalcanal. August 1942, the 1st Marine Division has carved out a perimeter around Henderson Field. the vital airstrip that will determine control of the Solomon Islands. The terrain is a nightmare of ravines, rivers, root systems, and volcanic mud that swallows men to the knee. Japanese forces launched night attacks through this green hell, moving along trails that barely exist, hauling their supplies and weapons on their backs because no vehicle can pass. And yet every morning the Marines have moved their positions. Artillery has been relocated. Supply dumps have been restocked. Wounded men have been evacuated. The Japanese commanders cannot understand the logistics. The Americans have no roads. The jungle should be impassable to vehicles. How are they sustaining a defensive perimeter that should have starved in days? The answer is jeeps, hundreds of them, moving supplies along trails that American engineers widen just enough for passage, fording streams, winching themselves up slopes, equipped with everything from stretcher racks to radio sets to improvised armor plating. A Marine Corps after-action report from Guadalcanal notes that a single jeep, in a 12-hour period, made 17 trips carrying ammunition forward and wounded rearward along a route that required 4 hours to walk. The vehicle operated continuously with only basic maintenance, oil checks, fuel, a wipe down of the air filter. When one jeep threw a tire in a crater, the crew removed the wheel, replaced it with a spare, and were moving again within 6 minutes. Japanese infantry, by contrast, were discovering the terrible cost of their logistical philosophy. The soldiers who landed on Guadalcanal expecting a swift victory found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition where supply lines stretched across submarine-infested waters. They fought with courage that stunned the Marines, launching bayonet charges against machine gun positions, enduring artillery bombardments in dugouts, refusing surrender even when wounded and starving. But courage could not substitute for calories. Japanese soldiers began subsisting on grass and roots, their bodies consuming themselves. Captured diaries from Guadalcanal, now preserved in the U.S. National Archives, tell stories of men too weak to carry their rifles, of entire squads losing the ability to march. One diary entry, dated November 3, 1942, reads, "5th day without rice. Chewed bark but cannot keep it down. Americans are everywhere with their machines. We have only our spirit, and spirit cannot pull our artillery piece through mud." The contrast was not merely material, it was philosophical. The Japanese had built a military culture that glorified deprivation, that taught soldiers to view suffering as spiritually ennobling. The Americans had built a military culture that glorified problem-solving, that taught soldiers to view obstacles as engineering challenges. When a jeep encountered a river too deep to ford, American combat engineers didn't ask their men to swim. They built a pontoon bridge or found a shallower crossing. When supply lines stretched too far, they didn't reduce rations. They organized airdrops and motor convoys. The Jeep was the perfect symbol of this philosophy, a machine that existed solely to reduce human suffering, to make the impossible routine, to multiply the effectiveness of every soldier who used it. By 1943, as the war expanded across multiple theaters, the Jeep had become ubiquitous in ways that transcended its original design. In North Africa, British long-range desert groups mounted machine guns and extra fuel tanks on Jeeps and used them for raids deep behind Axis lines, navigation by stars across dunes where no roads existed. In Italy, Jeeps equipped with cable winches hauled artillery pieces up mountain tracks that German defenders had assumed were impassable. In France, after D-Day, Jeeps became the backbone of reconnaissance operations, racing ahead of armored columns to identify enemy positions, mark minefields, and secure bridges. In Burma, British and American forces used Jeeps to supply Chindit columns, fighting in jungles where the Japanese thought resupply impossible. Each adaptation revealed something the original. Designers had not fully anticipated the Jeep was not merely a vehicle but a platform. Its simple chassis and standardized mounting points meant field modifications could be improvised anywhere. Soldiers welded armor plates scavenged from destroyed tanks. They mounted anti-tank weapons, stretcher racks, radio equipment powerful enough to communicate with aircraft. They removed windshields and doors to save weight for desert operations. They added canvas doors and heaters for winter fighting in the Ardennes. The Jeep absorbed every modification and kept functioning. Japanese forces, meanwhile, struggled with the opposite problem. Their motor vehicles, primarily trucks like the Type 97 and Type 1 Ho-Ha, were designed to specifications that prioritized durability over adaptability. They were well-built machines, but they could not be easily modified in the field. They required specialized parts. They consumed fuel at rates the Japanese supply system could not sustain. And most critically, they were too heavy for the terrain where Japan was increasingly forced to fight. As American strategy pivoted to island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, Japanese defenders found themselves on volcanic atolls where roads were non-existent, and the best transportation was still the human back. The Japanese produced excellent tanks, effective artillery, and capable trucks. But they produced them in numbers that could not match American industrial output, and they could not deliver them to the places where battles were fought. A striking example emerges from the Battle of Peleliu, September 1944. The island is a coral nightmare, jagged rocks, caves and ridges that turn every advance into a killing ground. Japanese defenders have fortified the Central Highlands with a network of tunnels and bunkers that makes them nearly immune to bombardment. They have prepared for a siege, stockpiling ammunition and supplies in underground complexes. What they have not prepared for is the speed of American logistics. Within 3 days of landing, U.S. Marines have established supply routes using jeeps that navigate between coral outcroppings, delivering ammunition, water, and medical supplies directly to frontline positions. Japanese observers, watching from cave entrances, report with frustration that American wounded are evacuated within minutes, while Japanese wounded lie in caves for days waiting for nightfall when movement might be possible. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. War is often decided not by a single climactic battle, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small advantages. A soldier who knows he will receive food, water, and ammunition regularly fights with confidence. A soldier who knows he will be evacuated if wounded fights without the paralysis of certain death. A soldier who sees his enemy supplied by an endless stream of vehicles while his own supplies dwindle fights with the knowledge that time is against him. The Jeep, appearing everywhere across the Pacific and European theaters, became a symbol of American inevitability, proof that the United States possessed resources so vast that it could afford to put every soldier in a vehicle, to motorize every supply line, to treat logistics not as a constraint but as a competitive advantage. Japanese military analysts, studying the pattern of defeats, began to revise their pre-war assumptions. A February 1944 intelligence report from the Imperial General Headquarters, captured after the war, notes with clinical precision: enemy motorization is not weakness, but strength. The small trucks allow rapid concentration of force and immediate redistribution. Our infantry advances on foot and arrives exhausted. Enemy infantry arrives by vehicle and fights fresh. This difference compounds across every engagement. The report recommends development of a light Japanese reconnaissance vehicle to match the Jeep's capabilities. Prototypes were designed. None entered mass production. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the fuel, and by 1944, the time. There is a particular irony in the Jeep's simplicity. The vehicle that Japanese officers dismissed as a toy was, in engineering terms, deliberately unsophisticated. It had no advanced technology. Its four-wheel drive system was based on principles developed in the 1930s. Its engine was a straightforward inline four-cylinder design with no remarkable innovations. What made the Jeep revolutionary was not any single component, but the integration of components into a package that prioritized functionality over elegance. It was designed to be built quickly, repaired easily, and used by soldiers with minimal training. In this sense, it was the mechanical embodiment of American mass production philosophy, the same thinking that allowed Ford to produce B-24. bombers on assembly lines and Kaiser shipyards to launch Liberty cargo, ships in weeks rather than months. The Japanese military-industrial complex operated on different principles. Japanese engineering culture emphasized craftsmanship, precision, and optimization. Japanese aircraft like the Zero fighter were masterpieces of weight reduction and aerodynamic efficiency, capable of outmaneuvering American fighters in the war's early years. Japanese torpedoes were the most advanced in the world. But these triumphs of engineering came at a cost. They were difficult to produce in quantity, difficult to repair in the field, and difficult to replace when lost. The Zero that dominated Pacific skies in 1942 was still being produced largely unchanged in 1945, while American fighters had gone through multiple generations of improvement. Japan built for quality, America built for quantity, and in total war, quantity has a quality all its own. Nowhere was this more evident than in the logistics of the Allied advance across Europe after D-Day. The American army that landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought with it not just soldiers, but an entire transportation network. By the end of June, more than 50,000 vehicles had been unloaded on the beaches, including thousands of jeeps. These vehicles became the circulatory system of the Allied advance, carrying orders from command posts to frontline units, transporting radio operators who coordinated artillery strikes, delivering hot food and ammunition, evacuating wounded to field hospitals within the critical first hour when survival rates are highest. The Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy system that supplied Patton's Third Army during its race across France in August 1944, depended on jeeps to manage traffic, guide convoys, and repair broken-down trucks along the route. The Express moved 12,500 tons of supplies per day along roads that had not been designed for such traffic, through a logistics network that stretched hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches to the German border. It was a triumph of organizational improvisation, and it would have been impossible without the Jeep's ability to go anywhere, communicate anywhere, and solve problems anywhere. German forces, retreating across France, could only watch with exhausted admiration. A captured Wehrmacht officer, interrogated in September 1944, told his American questioners, "We knew we could not win when we saw your supply columns. Every vehicle, every soldier motorized. We are fighting with horses and bicycles, and you are fighting with an entire nation of factories behind you." He paused, then added, "That little truck of yours, we called it the Amerikanische Maultier, the American mule. It is everywhere. It does everything. We have nothing like it." The Jeep had become something more than transportation. It had become the symbol of a particular vision of how modern war should be fought, not through the exaltation of suffering, but through the systematic application of industrial power to reduce suffering. Not through the glorification of the warrior spirit, but through the multiplication of each soldier's effectiveness. The Japanese had believed that Americans were soft, dependent on comfort, incapable of enduring hardship. What they failed to understand was that American military culture defined hardship differently. To the Japanese, hardship meant starvation, exhaustion, deprivation. To the Americans, hardship meant being inadequately supplied. The solution to the American definition of hardship was not spiritual fortitude, but better logistics. And the Jeep was the tool that made better logistics possible in places where logistics should not have been possible at all. By the time the war entered its final year, the disparity in mobility had become a chasm. American and British forces moved with a speed that German and Japanese commanders could not match or counter. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific turned into a systematic destruction of Japanese garrisons that were isolated, unsupplied, and unable to maneuver. In Europe, the Wehrmacht retreated not just because it was outnumbered, but because it could no longer concentrate forces quickly enough to counter Allied movements. The Red Army, supplied in part by American Lend-Lease trucks and jeeps, launched offensives that ground German defensive lines into dust through sheer material weight. Japanese soldiers, fighting in the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, found themselves defending static positions while American forces flowed around them like water, supplied by vehicles that appeared and disappeared along jungle trails. A Japanese officer captured on Luzon in January 1945 told interrogators, "We prepared every defensive position perfectly. We had fields of fire, interlocking bunkers, underground shelters, but you never attacked where we were strongest. You found the gaps? Your small trucks went where we thought vehicles could not go, and suddenly our flanks were turned. We could not respond because we could not move our heavy weapons. We could only watch and fight where we stood." This was the true revolution of the Jeep. It made warfare three-dimensional in a way that had never been fully possible before. Armies had always maneuvered, but maneuver had always been constrained by the speed of marching infantry and the availability of roads. The Jeep severed that constraint. It allowed commanders to think in terms of infiltration rather than frontal assault, to exploit enemy weaknesses rather than batter enemy strengths. It turned every trail into a potential supply route, every ford into a crossing point, every hilltop into a radio relay station. It made the battlefield fluid, and it did this not through technological sophistication, but through brutal simplicity. The Jeep worked because it was basic. It worked because any mechanic could fix it. It worked because it demanded nothing except fuel and oil, both of which America had in abundance. It worked because it was designed not for parade grounds, but for the worst conditions Earth could offer. Mud, sand, snow, jungle, mountain, desert. The Jeep functioned in all of them, not perfectly, but adequately. And adequacy, replicated 640,000 times, became overwhelming superiority. After the war ended, the Jeep did not fade into history. It became a commercial success, spawning an entire category of civilian vehicles. Jeeps were sold as surplus to farmers who used them to work rugged land. They were adapted for postal delivery, forest service patrols, and oilfield operations. The civilian Jeep CJ series entered production in 1945 and remained in production for 4 decades. The design influenced vehicles worldwide: the Soviet Gage 67, the British Land Rover, the Japanese Toyota Land Cruiser all trace their conceptual lineage to the wartime Jeep. The US military continued using evolved versions of the Jeep through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond, until the high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee, replaced it in the 1980s. But the Jeep's significance transcends its mechanical descendants. It represents a moment when American industrial philosophy proved decisive in the most consequential conflict in human history. The Japanese officers who laughed at it in 1942 were not fools. They were products of a military culture that valued different things: spiritual strength, endurance, the beauty of simplicity achieved through deprivation. They looked at the Jeep and saw softness, dependence, the corruption of the warrior spirit by material comfort. What they could not see or could not accept was that they were looking at the future of warfare. They were looking at a machine that embodied a different philosophy, that soldiers are valuable, that their lives should not be spent carelessly, that victory comes not from suffering but from systematic advantage. Accumulated across 1,000 fronts, the recurring image, the symbol that threads through every theater where the Jeep operated is not the vehicle itself, but what it carried: ammunition to soldiers who would otherwise have run out, water to men who would otherwise have died of thirst, wounded men who would otherwise have bled out in the mud, radio equipment that allowed coordination that would otherwise have been impossible. The Jeep was a delivery system for hope, for the promise that even in the worst conditions, even in jungles and deserts and mountains far from home, American soldiers would not be abandoned. They would be supplied. They would be supported. They would be brought home if they fell. This was the true abundance that the Jeep represented, not material wealth for its own sake, but the wealth to ensure that human life was not discarded casually. The Japanese military had made a virtue of accepting death, of training soldiers to fight to the last man. The American military, for all its flaws and contradictions, had made a different calculation, that the purpose of superior logistics was to bring soldiers home alive. The Jeep was the instrument of that promise. In the end, the laughter of January 1942 was silenced not by a single dramatic defeat, but by the accumulated weight of 3 years of conflict in which the side with the Jeeps consistently outmaneuvered, outfought, and outlasted the side without them. The transformation was complete when Japanese veterans, interviewed decades after the war, spoke of the Jeep not with contempt, but with a kind of rueful respect. One veteran, speaking to an American historian in 1985, said, "We thought you were weak because you needed machines. We did not understand that the machines made you strong. We thought victory belonged to the man who could endure the most suffering. You proved that victory belongs to the man who can eliminate suffering from the battlefield." That, perhaps, is the Jeep's lasting epilogue. It was the vehicle that conquered terrain not through brute force, but through persistence, that won battles not through firepower, but through presence. It carried supplies, men, ideas, and hope across every battlefield of the Second World War. It made the impossible routine, and in doing so, it became the rolling embodiment of a particular American ideal, that problems are meant to be solved, that suffering is meant to be reduced, that engineering and abundance are not signs of weakness, but foundations of strength. The Japanese officers who laughed at it learned this lesson too late to change the outcome of the war. But they learned it. In the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, in the jungles of Bougainville, in the ruins of Manila, they saw the little boxy trucks everywhere, always moving, always delivering, always present. The Jeep had become the proof that in modern war, the army that can supply its soldiers anywhere can win everywhere. And that is a truth that transcends ideology, transcends culture, transcends even the particular conflict in which it was proven. The Jeep conquered every battlefield terrain because it was designed to do one thing perfectly: keep moving forward no matter what. In war, as in history, that is often enough.